We'll start in 1 minute. Okay, let's get started. Come on in. All right, take your seats. Come on in, everybody. Lunch is over. Yes, I'm stalling for time. All right, so this is the start of the 2 p.m. session on cryptographic standardization. I'm Brian Lamacchia. I'm one of the steering committee members. I do have a little bit of business from the last session to take care of first before we start. So is Brent Zundel, who gave one of the lightning talks, here? Brent? Brent's the gentleman who got up and admitted that it was 3 days since his last use of blockchain. Does anyone see Brent? I have something for you. Okay, I don't see Brent anywhere, so I will award this to Brent, and hopefully he'll come find me later, because he doesn't know this is coming. Okay, so at Asia Crypt this year, during the Rump Session talk, there were some prizes that were donated to the Rump Session committee by parties unknown. They were sets of cards against cryptography. Now, the sources for these are on GitHub, and I took the sources for these, and I made some sets for my team, and I brought a couple extra decks with me. So an informal committee of the steering committee for RWC decided that Brent had the best lightning talk. No one knew that there were, but I think we can all agree that his talk was. So he is hereby awarded in a, as close to official as any of these can be, an official set of cards against cryptography, and maybe you can get him to play a game with you later. So I have that for Brent when he comes by me. He's on his way. Excellent. Well, if he gets here before I finish the rest of my intro, then we can call him up. I have another deck that I will be awarding at 4 o'clock today for another prize. And you all can tweet now and try to guess what that one's going to be for. But I'm going to hold that till 4 o'clock. Okay, so now I'm going to stall for time until Brent gets here, or until I run out of time. As you all know, we were supposed to get an announcement from NIST now of round 2 candidates for the NIST post-quantum competition. Let me tell you how that came about and why that's not going to happen for those of you who are not in the United States. NIST published to the mailing list that they were going to make their round 2 announcement sometime in January. As soon as I saw that, I contacted Dustin Moody at NIST on behalf of the RWC steering committee, and I said, Dustin, we would be honored if you would, and we will make time for you in the schedule if NIST would like to make its announcement here at RWC. We can't think of a better place to make a real-world cryptography announcement than RWC 2019. They looked at the dates, they came back, Dustin conferred, and the rest, they said, yes, we'd love to do that. Please, can you get us 15 minutes of time? And so we did that, and we put that onto the schedule, and that's why it was a late addition to the schedule. And we were all set to hear today the round 2 candidates. And then the government partially shut down. Now, for those of you who are not US residents or aware of this, the U.S. government gets funded through a series of appropriation bills get passed by the House and the Senate and then signed by the President, and they appropriate money on a department-by-department basis. And there are currently something like 9 major cabinet departments, including the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Commerce, that are not funded right now. NIST is an agency of the Department of Commerce. When an agency is unfunded, employees get segregated into 2 camps, the essential and the non-essential. NIST is apparently non-essential, or at least everybody dealing with anything that we all care about is deemed non-essential. Essential is, preservation of life and property and things like that, which is why the Transportation Security Agency, which is part of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which is also unfunded, they're all working without paychecks. So please, when you talk to your TSA people, when you leave, thank them for working unfunded. They're having a hard time right now. Everybody who is working for the government or is furloughed. If you're essential, you have to work without a paycheck, and you will hopefully get paid at the end of this whole thing. If you are not essential, you are furloughed, you are not allowed to work, and you are prohibited from doing any communication or any work. You're not allowed to send mail, you're not allowed to read mail, you're not allowed to stand at a podium and tell who the round 2 candidates are in the NIST post-quantum competition, even if we pay for it, right? We actually offered to fly everybody out, that's not a problem. They're not allowed to work. So NIST really wants to be here. They're not allowed to be here because of the current situation in DC. So I hope we all appreciate NIST's efforts to date in the competition, and we hope that the impasse in DC is resolved soon and that they're able to make their round 2 announcements. So that's why we don't have an announcement here, not through any fault of anybody from NIST. It has to do with some of the other people in DC. And I'll leave my commentary there. Okay. And here is Brent. You, sir, you don't know why you're here, do you?
Dan Bonet told me I had to come to the stage.
Yes.
Figured.
Okay, so they know and you don't. You had the best lightning talk. Your prize is an official, well, as close to official as can be, a set of Cards Against Cryptography. Yes. Congratulations. Well done. All right, so with that out of the way, let's start with the first talk, which will be Jordan Whitefield, right? Yes. Okay, here comes Jordan. All right, I ate into 2 minutes of your time, so we'll make sure you get that back. And the mic's there. Turn this one off.
Great. Okay, microphone's working. Great. So thank you for the opportunity for letting me talk to you all today. And today I want to speak briefly a bit about our work that we've done with DAA, with myself and my co-authors. So today I'm going to speak a bit about DAA in theory, a bit of the history, how it's come about to be, and some of the formal analysis work that we've done on it. So already this year we've heard MLS use Tamarin, and also we had the talk by Noise Explorer, which was also using Proverith. And moving on from kind of the theory into the real world, we're looking to see how we could apply to DAA to something a bit more concrete that hasn't been done before. So we propose a vehicle use case, and I will speak a bit about the implementation we've done and some of the various lessons and challenges that we faced. So what is Direct Anonymous Attestation, or DAA? It's an anonymous digital group signature scheme that provides privacy-preserved authentication, standardized in the ISO IEC 20008 in 2013. And this was a scheme that was originally designed for the Trusted Platform Module, or TPM, which is a secure crypto processor that creates, stores, and uses keys. And using the hardware, we can actually make hardware-backed attestations to report something about the status or the state of a host. And there are two interesting properties for DAA, so user-controlled anonymity and user-controlled traceability. And since DAA is a split signing scheme, the host or the computer has some kind of choice about whether they want to remain anonymous or whether they want to be linkable or not. So DAA was originally developed with the Trusted Computing Group and first came to be in 2004 and was introduced in the actual TPM 1.2 spec back in, 2000 and something. And we see this today still in the ISO 20008-2, more specifically Mechanism 4. And as DAA itself has been developed over time and the TPM has had various updates regarding its API, we're actually seeing TPM 2.0 become released, which also introduced many different DAA schemes, but in particular, I wanted to pick pairing-based schemes, one based on elliptic curves. And this also made it into the same ISO standard and Mechanism 4. But since other DAA schemes were introduced, new APIs came out, and the TPM command calls were made more flexible and also standardized in yet another ISO standard, 11889. The reason for this introduction, well, RSA is slow and uses bigger key sizes, so ECC was meant to be, or is more efficient using smaller keys and smaller signatures. And beyond the TPM, it's also been introduced for FIDO 2.0 for ECC DAA, and beyond TPM and also these YubiKey type devices, we also see enhanced privacy IT, which is also being used in Intel's SGX technology, and in comparison to the other schemes, has improved revocation capabilities. So some of the vulnerabilities that have occurred over time have more been in the security models of DAA. But one of the pieces of work I wanted to speak about particular today was the analysis done by Akar et al. In 2013, where essentially their analysis of the TPM 2.0 API actually allowed a static Diffie-Hellman oracle, which means over time, DAA can be exploited to essentially recover the key after many different signing requests. So obviously this isn't a good thing to have, so this required a change in the protocol and also ultimately one or two commands from the TPM being removed. But more generally, a problem beyond the scope of DAA is obviously the BNP256 curve, which the ECC DAA scheme relies on, and cryptanalysis has shown this to be weak, so we're looking to see 128 bits of security get reduced down to 85 bits. So the fix to this is kind of trivial. Well, you move to a larger curve. And lucky enough, one's already been specified for DAA using the BNP638 curve. So briefly, DAA, as I mentioned previously, is a split signing role where the secure operations are done by the TPM, and the host can perform more computationally intensive tasks, and together they form what's known as the platform. And this platform, when it comes out of manufacturing phase, typically comes endorsed with some type of key by Infineon or potentially the laptop manufacturer. And to start off the DAA process, the TPM first generates its own DAA key, and during this time, it speaks with the issuer, who is a trusted third party, and makes some kind of non-anonymous attestation to it to prove that it's a valid TPM in some kind of state. So with that, the issuer sees that, can verify that request, and generate a credential to give to the platform. And the platform will receive this credential, which it can use to make later attestations. And then now using this credential, it can make anonymous attestations with our verifier, who is another entity. So perhaps this is some form of data collector, a bank, some kind of activity tracker. When it creates this message, it signs some data with the DAA key and randomizes the credential each time, meaning that if the user does want to be anonymous or does want to be linked, then the host is in complete control of this. And the verifier then receives that message and checks with the issuer public key whether this did in fact come from a valid attested TPM. So some formal analysis work we've done using the Tamrin prover is we performed a symbolic security analysis of the ECC DAA scheme, and we actually discovered that if the insecurity of a single TPM is affected, then the security of all TPMs are actually compromised. So what this means is that we found a theoretical attack on the authentication property of the join protocol, And using our analysis, we identified a fix for this by including the TPM public endorsement key in the proof of knowledge during a sign. So we do have some work on this. We currently have a paper under review, and we hope to make this available soon. But if anybody wants some more details, then please do come and find me. So now moving on to the implementation portion, we actually looked and tried to consider a new novel use case where we hadn't seen DAA before. And in particular, we wanted to target vehicle-to-anything communication or V2X communication. And this is what we will see in future systems where cars will need to communicate with one another. And some of the properties, security and privacy properties that are required in V2X communication are actually not too dissimilar from that of DAA. So we thought, oh, there was quite a nice fit there, so let's see how far we can take this. And the current state-of-the-art proposes to use public key infrastructure, and various other literature has said that there's problems in terms of the scalability and revocation in these systems. And the TCG also has announced in 2015 a automotive thin profile, so they're very keen and they're pushing hard in industry to try and get TPM chips within cars. So again, picking the DAA algorithm that was originally designed and is present in the TPM seemed like quite a good choice and a natural fit. And what we were wanting to do is to have a shift of trust from the infrastructure to locally within vehicles, which now have some kind of trusted hardware inside them, so that they'll be responsible to create their own credentials, sign them with the DAA key, such that all other vehicles or other entities can actually verify this. So this just allows the shift of trust to edge points in cars, so hopefully trying to promote a more decentralized architecture. So the implementation, as I said, we wanted to make it as real as possible. So you can see on the picture there that there is a Nexcom VTC in-vehicle computer, and this is actually computers that are in cars today. They're heavily resource constrained. They are about, this one in particular had a Intel Atom dual-core 32-bit processor, so this is the kind of level we're currently working with in cars at the moment. And obviously it didn't have a TPM. So we had to hook it up to a Raspberry Pi, and we used a Infineon 2.0 developer module to do this. The software is fairly standard, but points of interest here are the Apache Milagro crypto library, which we found really useful, and also use of the IBM Trusted Software Stack. We picked that mainly because that's the stack that we knew. So to give you an idea of the implementation, we can see that the join operation takes around 820 milliseconds, which is quite high, but in reality, this is an operation which may only be executed once. But also the pairings operation on this resource-constrained device taking around 200 milliseconds, which, considering the capability, that's not too bad. So what were some of the challenges? Well, first of all, one of the more interesting ones is even though we bought all the TPMs at the same time and they all came out the same box, they actually all had different versions on them, which was quite interesting. So over time, as I said, as DAA has been developed and the TPM itself has, all sorts of errata versions of documentation comes out, which means at various points in different operations, we had to consider different ways of actually implementing the protocol. So in this case, we had a 1.16 to 1.14 errata, which demanded it be implemented in one way, and so on and so forth. So this just made the code base much more complex and potentially much more difficult to maintain in the future. And but on top of the errata version and all the different versions you have to be aware of and where the documentation differs, there's also the complexity and the barrier of entry to developing TPM. So if anybody's tried this before, it's around 1,600 pages of documentation. So it's not easy to get into at all. And despite this, also the insecure curves being announced from cryptanalysis, so the P256 curve has been found significantly weaker. So the P638 curve, we thought we would try that. Even though it's specified in their standard, not a single TPM to this day are we aware of that implements this curve. So we really need to be talking to each other, the community, and also to the TCG to try and update the standards to suggest some secure curves that can go in. So anybody that is using this curve will no longer be affected. And compatible crypto libraries, it's slightly more exotic. So the crypto wasn't widely implemented, and the TPM has fixed points on the curve and generators. I very briefly want to shamelessly plug one of the projects that we're working on at the University of Surrey. So we're actually looking at the next future TPM, and in particular making one that's quantum resistant. So the DAA scheme's been developed further by some of my colleagues to make a lattice-based DAA. But on top of this, they're also doing security analysis of the TPM to make sure that the next TPM we release is even better than now. So if you're interested to find out more, then you can visit their website, futuretpm.eu, or you can contact them directly on Twitter. So to conclude my talk, TPM for the development is hard just because of all the documentation. It's not trivial, and you need to be aware of absolutely every single small change. We need to consider other use cases for DAA, because to this day, we're not quite sure who's using it, so we're really interested to find out if people want to use it. But also the FIDO2 scheme, ECDAA, because of some of our formal symbolic analysis, we're also wanting to revisit that scheme to make sure that we can make that as good as possible. So thank you. If anybody has any questions or comments, thank you.
So we've got time for one or two quick questions.
If you imagine this being deployed in a V2V infrastructure, about how pseudonymous and how unlinkable do you think the vehicles would be as a practical matter?
So we only have kind of like a proof of concept implementation now. So when vehicles do communicate with one another, their credentials will change fairly frequently. So DAA has been proved to provide these properties, but actually when we have to consider the cyber physical world as well, perhaps there's more work there where maybe crypto will help or maybe it won't, but we're not sure. But thank you.
Thanks.
All right, let's thank the speaker again. And our next speaker is Martin Albrecht. So how hard is solving LWE anyway?
The wrong way around. God damn it. I promise you it did work when I tested it earlier. Computers, nobody understands them. I'm in the process of doing exactly that. Unify. Let's try that. All right, success. Okay, thanks for having me and sorry for the delay. So the question I'm asking is, how hard is it to solve LWE and entry-based schemes? This is based on joint work with many co-authors and also based on the work of many other people, which I had nothing to do with. All right, so my opening gambit is this. So these are 5 schemes that were submitted to the NIST post-quantum competition, which is not a competition. And so in the columns, you see 5 different schemes. And in the rows, I give you the cost model or the assumptions, how long does it take to break the underlying hard problem that these schemes rely on. And what you see in this table are not necessarily the numbers that designers have in their own submissions, but if you take the assumption that these designers have, and then you run a standard attack under these assumptions, this is the bit security that you get, right? So Kyber's assumption leads to an estimate of 180 bits of security for Kyber. And if you apply the same assumption to Lima, another submission, then you get 218 bits of security. Whereas if you take the assumptions that are made in the streamlined N2 prime submission, then you would get something like 500 bits of security for Kyber. So what this table is supposed to illustrate, so it really doesn't matter to compare the schemes against each other. I just picked random parameter choices. Well, really what I want to highlight here, that there's no agreement in the community about like how hard is it to solve this underlying hard problem. And that's maybe something you want to address. And I'm going to I added the word entry to the title because I was talking about some entry schemes. And now, somewhat shamelessly, I'm going to sweep that back under the rug and talk about LWE. But the logic that I'm discussing, it applies to entry-based schemes in the same way. So fundamentally, what this is a disagreement about is the difficulty of solving this problem. I give you a matrix, mod Q, which is public. So I guess I give it to you, I just said that. And I give you a vector C, and this vector C is computed by multiplying this public matrix A by some secret vector S, which has small coefficients, and then I add a small perturbation vector E. And then given A and C, your job as the attacker is to find S. All right, so that's the hard problem that we're trying to solve here, the learning with errors problem. So a straightforward attack on this would be called the primal attack. And we can arrive at the primal attack by simply looking at the equation that I've just displayed, but let's look at that over the integers. So all that means is instead of having implicit modular reductions modulo Q, we write them down explicitly, right? So I have to do some additions and some subtractions of multiples of Q to push everything in the right range. And then I can write this down in matrix form, and I end up with this basis B, which has Q on the diagonal, and then you have ones on the diagonal, you have minus A and C. And we know if you multiply this from the right by the correctly chosen vector, then you get a short vector. That means you get the concatenation of E, S, and 1. And as I told you before, the vector E has small entries, the vector S has small entries, and 1 certainly is a small integer. So what this means in the column span of this basis, if you do only integer linear combinations, there is a very short vector there, right? So you can find a combination of the columns that sums to something that's just very small, and in fact, it is unusually small. There will be no other thing that is as small, and that's why this is called the unique shortest vector problem approach, because we have something uniquely short. Right, and so this is the computational problem that we're actually looking at. How hard is it to find this unique shortest vector in a basis of this form? And this is what essentially this table highlights a disagreement. Okay, so how would we go about solving this problem? We apply lattice reduction. And when we want to talk about lattice reduction, it will be useful to talk not only about the vectors, which are the columns of our matrix B, but also talk about something called the Gram-Schmidt vectors. So the Gram-Schmidt vector of a vector bi, denoted bi star, is that vector, but I take away everything that was already covered by previous vectors. Right? So I look at this vector and only look at what is new, essentially. And so this means we speak of this as projecting orthogonally. And so, for example, here I have two vectors on the slide, B0 and B1. And B0 is its own Gram-Schmidt vector because there's nothing previously that I need to take away. But the vector B1, well, it also goes a little bit in the direction of B0. So how about we take that contribution away? And then if we do that, we end up with B1 star, which is B1 star, but only the new stuff that it's at, so to speak. All right. And if we have these Gram-Schmidt vectors, right, for all the columns of our matrix, then we can look at their length, and we can look at the log of these lengths, and we can plot them. So all the Gram-Schmidt business was really to explain to you what this plot means. And you can see if you take a matrix of the shape as this basis B that I mentioned earlier, then you get this Z shape. So you first have your Q's, and then you have your ones. And everything is already orthogonal, which why everything looks nicely. All right, so that's the input. That's the geometric shape of our input problem. Now to show you what lattice reduction does, I'm applying the famous LLL algorithm. So LLL is the oldest lattice reduction algorithm. It is efficient, it's polynomial time, but it gives you only a lattice that is somewhat good, right? It doesn't give you something that's good enough that we can actually break these schemes. But let's apply that and then look again at the lengths of these vectors or the logs of these lengths. And as you can see, we now get this line. And essentially, what we expect from also stronger lattice reduction is a line like that. And our lattice reduction is the better, the flatter this line is. So the front comes down, the back goes up, right? And the more resources you are investing, the more you push the front down, and the more the back comes up. So that essentially, lattice reduction and what people are arguing about is to make this line more parallel. Okay, so why does this matter? It matters because the slope tells you how expensive it is to find this unique shortest vector. So this plot you have to read from the back, and what we want is that this dashed line, where the dotted line and the solid line intersect, is as far to the back as possible, because that gives me the work factor that I have to do to find this unique shortest vector. And so if I have an algorithm that pushes the front down and the back up, then I can move this dashed line further to the end, which is where I want to be, because then my algorithm is cheaper. And this dotted line is essentially the same process that I've done for the Gram-Schmidt vectors, taking away all the previous contributions. I'm applying the same process, but to my target vector. And that's how I arrive at this dotted line. And that's the success condition that, by the way, everybody agrees on, right? That is the success condition you should consider. So this is not a point of disagreement. So far, everything is nice. We agree on everything. OK, next step is, I told you, lattice reduction, what it does is it reduces the slope. So how does it reduce the slope? It depends on something called the block size, which is the main parameter for our lattice reduction, which then in turn determines something called the root Hermite factor delta, which then in turn determines the slope. And again, to translate from the block size to the expected slope is something that is not contested, right? That's something that we agree on. You can compute fairly accurately the expected slope that you would expect from a given block size. All right. So I talked about block size. So let me briefly tell you why this matters and what this means. So here I'm looking at the BKZ algorithm, which is this algorithm that we are all considering when we talk about strong lattice reduction. And my example, I have block size 5. So what that means is I consider up to 5 vectors at a time. And I'm going to ask an oracle, hey, oracle, you claim you are shortest vector oracle. Could you please give me the shortest vector that is in the span of these 5 vectors? OK, so I call out to my SVP oracle. My SVP oracle is slightly upset with me. It says, like, yes, I'm an SVP oracle. Of course, here you go. So it gives me back a shortest vector. I insert it. I handle some linear dependencies. And I'm done with this block. All right? Then I move on to the next 5 vectors. And I'm not technically touching those 5 vectors. I'm looking at some projections of them. But for now, let's just assume I'm looking at the next 5 vectors. And I'm playing the same game. I say, like, hey, dear shortest vector oracle, would you be so kind to give me a shortest vector? And it says, sure, Martin, here you go. I take it, I insert it, handle linear dependencies, and move on. And I keep on doing that until I hit the end. And when I hit the end, I simply start at the beginning, and I keep on doing this, and I keep on doing this. Right? And I stop doing this when there is no more progress to be made. Right, so I keep on going round, and going round once is called a tour, and I keep on doing these tours until my basis doesn't improve anymore. And this process will eventually stabilize, and then we say we have a BKZ reduced basis. But in practice, we just can't stop after a few tours because the improvements that you make, they become smaller and smaller. How much, you may ask, and so here's an example of running this algorithm on some lattice. The blue line would be the output of LLL reduction, so similar to what I've showed you earlier. And then the orange line is the output of BKZ60, so we have 60 vectors at the time that we are considering. And we went through once, right? And then the green line is going through twice, and the pink line going through 3 times, and then the brown line. As you can see, these lines, they're approaching this black line, right? Which is what theory tells us. This is the shape that we're expecting afterwards. And it's not quite this line, but this dotted line. But you can pre-compute that in the simulation, so that's also something that's easy to predict. All right, I'm finally in a position after this prelude of telling you about like what are we actually arguing about to kind of discuss one of the first disagreements. I just told you that after 4 to 8 tours, we are done, right? So you need at most this many. And in each tour, for each index, you're calling your SVP oracle. So that means you're calling your SVP oracle in each tour d times. You have up to 8 tours, so 8 times d and whatever the cost of my SVP oracle is, right? So that would be some estimate for how much work do I have to invest in order to compute this BKZ reduced basis. On the other hand, you can argue that, well, the basis keeps improving, and maybe we can amortize some costs. So how about we say, well, we have to call our SVP oracle at least once. Right, that's certainly true. So how about we simply write 1 instead of 8d? Right, and that would be a first disagreement amongst designers. Simply, if you pick this lower bound, and we have no algorithm that achieves that, or if you pick the estimate that is slightly too conservative because we know we can do slightly better, somewhere in between is the correct. But on the other hand, it gives you a difference of maybe 14 bits, and given how widely spread those numbers are, maybe that's not the most important disagreement. OK, so essentially what this algorithm does, it keeps on solving SVP over and over again, right? And the number of calls accounts for maybe 14 bits of difference, but the big disagreement, of course, is how expensive is it to solve the shortest vector problem, right? My oracle that I called out to, how expensive is it to call this oracle? And here is the big disagreement. So the first 3 lines in my table, they are about a class of algorithms called sieving, and the last 2 lines of my table are about an algorithm called lattice point enumeration. So sieving works by you produce many vectors, so you do essentially random linear combinations of the columns of this matrix, then you have a huge selection of vectors, and then you pairwise check whether when you add or subtract a pair, then you get something that's shorter than the inputs. If you find something that's great, you add it to your set of vectors and you keep on going. And you keep on doing this process until eventually you have something which is short enough. And the good news about this algorithm is that it's a single exponential algorithm, right? So it only runs in single exponential time, which as a cryptanalyst is very efficient. On the other hand, before you see these collisions, right, before you actually have any chance of seeing 2 things that sum to something which is shorter, you actually need exponentially many vectors. So this algorithm intrinsically requires exponential memory as well. Enumeration, on the other hand, is essentially an exhaustive search within a given radius of trying to find all vectors that in this lattice, and it uses properties of projections. You project it down to one-dimensional problem, you try to solve it there, you lift it up, you see how does it extend, you lift it up, and so on. And the good news about this algorithm is that it only requires polynomial memory, so that's great. The bad news is this is a super exponential algorithm. And it depends on which class of enumeration algorithm you're looking at, what you're considering. It's either quasi-linear in the exponent or it's quadratic in the exponent. And as you can see, the 2 cost models that I picked, one of them is quasi-linear, the other one is quadratic, right? And so it depends a bit on like how much preprocessing are you doing. That tells you in which of the 2 regimes you are. So let's look at these 2 estimates a little bit. And so both of these estimates are actually based off the same data. So in Yuan-Mi Chen's thesis, they have simulation results for how long it would take to run enumeration on lattices up to dimension 250. So that's the green line. I hope you can see this. And then the difference between these 2 cost models is simply whether you fit a quasi-linear function through this or you fit a quadratic function through this. Right? And then using that fit, you extrapolate, and then that gives you the cost of the whole attack, because we don't have any data for things that are larger than 250. Okay, and the problem is we didn't have any additional data, and also no source code was published in that thesis that would allow us to extend this to see, like, how does this develop. However, things have changed since then, and in particular, public open source implementations of lattice reduction have improved a lot. And so what I've done for this talk is I've extended the data of Yuan-Mi Chen. So I've run essentially the same simulations as they did, but this time I can the source code of this will be made publicly available, so you can verify that this was done correctly. And so what I've done, I've extended this data to dimension 330 or something like that. And as you can see, the quasi-linear fit fits my simulation quite nicely, but the quadratic fit is too pessimistic. So it assumes that lattice reduction is more expensive than it really is, right? And here we're talking about lattice reduction not in theory, but the lattice reduction is implemented in a public open source implementation, namely FPLL. But of course, these are simulation results, so a natural comeback would be to say, but maybe the implementation doesn't actually achieve what your simulation predicts. So on this slide, I give you in green, this is the running time of actual FPL, so the actual software, and then just take seconds and translate that to the unit that we're considering here, which is how many points in your exhaustive search are you visiting. The blue dashed line would be the output of my simulation as previously, and then the red dotted line is I asked the FPL software, so how many points did you actually visit? And as you can see, those 3 lines converge, which suggests to me that indeed the simulation is fairly accurate in predicting the efficiency of FPL. A last point I want to make about the quasi-linear versus quadratic estimate for enumeration is there's also the quasi-linear fit actually fits quite closely what theory would predict. And that is Kanan's enumeration, which is this family of enumeration that has quasi-linear complexity in the exponent. We know that the worst case leading coefficient, the leading exponent, is 1 over 2e, and that is actually quite close what this numerical approximation gives us, right? So it seems we're actually achieving the complexity, the worst case complexity that would be predicted for Kanan's enumeration. And the natural question is, if we are stuck in this worst case, or whether inside BKZ we can maybe bring down this leading coefficient. So that is something that is an open question. All right, but the big question, of course, is the one question is, what is the right cost model for enumeration? But the big question is, of course, sieving versus enumeration. Right, so sieving is asymptotically faster, but maybe the asymptotics only kick in so late that we don't have to worry about it, right? So because the constants, the hidden constants are so huge, maybe there's just no way in hell that this will actually outperform enumeration for the parameters that we care about. So to study this problem of kind of how low can we push the crossover between enumeration and sieving, we developed Jessica, which is a Python and C++ framework for experimenting with sieving algorithms inside and outside BKZ. And in particular, what we've done is we haven't taken this oracle view that I appealed to earlier, but instead we're thinking of sieving as stateful machines. Remember that you have these large databases of vectors that you carry around, and instead of throwing them away after we give you a shortest vector, we hold on to them to do some further computations with them. And then we implemented several sieving algorithms, so there's a whole class of algorithms. We implemented some of them. I want to stress that we did not implement the asymptotically fastest one that are used in these estimates. And then we applied many recent tricks from the literature and came up with some new tricks to make sieving faster. And if you put all of this together, we can report that sieving outperforms enumeration in block size 70. So the green dots, this would be the same thing that I've shown you before when I showed you the experimental results. So that's the same software again. And the red dots is our sieve implementation for performing the same task of computing the shortest vector. And as you can see, it outperforms, or the crossover is in block size 70. And to clarify, block size 70 is something that takes less than 10 seconds, right? So the crossover on, if you're running this on one big machine that has enough RAM to fit all these vectors in, between sieving and enumeration is actually very small. It is not very late. The canonical benchmark for lattice reduction algorithms would be the Darmstadt SVP challenges. And despite being called the Darmstadt SVP challenge, the Darmstadt SVP challenge does not ask you to solve SVP, because it's actually really hard to verify that the thing that somebody gives you is the shortest vector. So it asks you to solve a slightly easier problem. So the red dotted line will be my simulation for enumeration for solving SVP exactly. The green line would be using the same methodology, the simulation of solving the problem that the Darmstadt SVP challenge asks you to solve. And then the blue and the red dots would be entries from the Hall of Fame, right? So people who claimed world records in performing this computation and the time that they reported how long it took them to solve this problem. And as you can see, my green line and these dots, they seem to somewhat agree. At this point, I want to stress that my green line going through these dots in no way diminishes the achievement of these dots, because my line is just a simulation, right? And it's a simulation that assumes everything parallelizes perfectly, right? And we know that this is not the case. So that these guys actually managed to achieve this complexity is a huge accomplishment. Right, then finally, the green dots are our sieving algorithm. As you can see, we are significantly outperforming prior art when it comes to solving these challenges. And then we were also able to claim some new world records in computing short vectors in the Darmstadt SVP challenge, up to dimension 155. All right, I want to stress, so this is indicative of that sieving is practical. But on the other hand, what we have not is an implementation that actually parallelizes across different machines, right? And then there, it's not quite clear how this exactly is supposed to work, because you have this exponential memory, and then you have nodes that have to communicate. So this is future work. Also, what is not clear at the moment is the practical performance of the asymptotically faster sieves. We didn't implement those. And there will be more overhead, certainly. So it's not quite clear when exactly those beat the sieves that we actually did implement. And then, of course, a fun open question is, what if you have dedicated hardware, right? So far, everything was on commodity CPUs, and then if we have dedicated CPUs or hardware, then maybe there's something else possible. Right, I'm almost done. 3 more points. So the first one is, we're talking here about the post-quantum competition, which is not a competition, but so far I've only talked about classical estimates, right? All the algorithms that I talked about are on classical computers, which is why we could implement them and test them. And since this is real-world crypto, let's talk about a bunch of algorithms on computers that do not exist. So what I give you on this slide would be the best estimates for classical and quantum sieving and classical and quantum enumeration. And as you can see for sieving, the improvement that you're seeing is actually fairly minimal. So the leading coefficient goes from 0.292 to 0.265. Right? Whereas for enumeration, you see the Grover speedup. Right? You have the 1/2 and the exponent, which means you're taking a square root. And both of these are actually, like, the strategy is fairly similar. You find the place where you have an exhaustive search in your algorithm, you slap your Grover on that, and you claim your 1/2. And in the case of enumeration, you can't quite do that, so you need a quantum backtracking algorithm, but Montanaro has provided one. And then some people worked out kind of how to apply it exactly. All right, so but a question that you might ask yourself is, why is the performance of quantum sieving so poor compared to classical sieving? And the reasons that I want to give you is, firstly, remember that sieving works by producing this large set of vectors and then looking for collisions, essentially. But whatever you do, like however efficient you're doing your collision search, you have to write down this large list of vectors first, right? There's nothing that gets you around that, at least as far as we know. So that's an inherent limitation for how low you can go. The second and perhaps more important point is that these asymptotically faster sieving algorithms that we see in the literature, they're really exploiting that the search space that you're searching through is not unstructured. It's actually quite structured. And Grover's search really is for unstructured search. To illustrate this, consider the simple sieve algorithm called the Gauss sieve. And if you do that and do your most optimistic estimate for slapping Grover on that, then you end up with a quantum complexity where the leading coefficient is 0.311. You can actually achieve the very same complexity classically without any increase in memory by implementing the so-called BGJ sieve, which is the one that we also implemented in Jessica. And this is simply using the fact that the search space is quite structured. And so these asymptotically faster algorithms, what they're doing is they're successfully reducing the list that you need to search through, which makes them faster. But now if the lists that you need to search through are smaller, the speed up that you can get from Grover becomes smaller as well. So there's less of a potential for a Grover-style algorithm to improve. So if you want to have more efficient algorithms, quantum algorithms in the spirit of sieving, we really need new ideas, right? Because the better sieving algorithms, they make Grover harder and harder to shine. Then I want to make a point about lower bounds, because the table entries that I've shown you at the beginning, they were not necessarily of the form, we think there exists an algorithm that can solve this problem with this complexity. They were rather of the form, we think any algorithm in this family of algorithms, so plausible, will have to do at least this many operations, right? So they're explicit lower bounds. And so what this means is polynomial factors are completely ignored. The maximum depth, like how long you can run a quantum computation, is completely ignored. Then also, when we compare classical and quantum, we're actually comparing CPU cycles and Grover iterations. And one Grover iteration is most definitely more expensive than one CPU cycle. So there's huge overheads that are simply being ignored. And thus, I want to kind of issue a word of caution in 2 regards. Firstly, if somebody comes up with a new lower bound, and maybe here's a new plausible lower bound, then this in no way implies that schemes need to update their parameters, right? Because a new lower bound does not imply that they've actually found an algorithm that achieves anything like this lower bound. All they're claiming is, here's a new lower bound. So you have to be very careful about how to interpret some results from the literature. And secondly, you want to be very careful about how you interpret results in these models. And that is, if you assume the cost of lattice reduction is indeed the lower bound, then some classes of attacks simply do not work. You don't need to consider them. It's just like this strategy is just that. It's just not efficient. But whenever you plug in an actually realistic cost model for how long lattice reduction takes, then these techniques start to work. And so what this means, if you always consider only the lower bounds, you might rule out some classes of attacks that are actually quite promising, that actually allow us to learn something about the problem, but we're not studying them because we assume that they don't work because, like, look, in this lower bound model, they don't work. So you have to be really careful about that. Okay, final point. It would be irresponsible to talk about this without mentioning and stressing all the things that I didn't talk about. So first of all, I've only talked about very vanilla LWE problem, but many of the submissions to the NIST process, they actually use small and sparse secrets. So they deviate from this vanilla formulation, and a different family of algorithms applies. Essentially, you're guessing some bits of the secret and so on. And here, I think there is still some room for improvement, so this needs further studying. Also, I completely swept under the rug algebraic structure. So to make these schemes efficient, we don't have actually random matrices A, but these matrices A have some algebraic structure in there. And it's not clear if this algebraic structure can't be exploited. So for example, the ideal SVP problem, or some approximation of the ideal SVP problem, is easier on a quantum computer than the general problem that I've discussed here. And ring LWE, if you pick your parameters right and so on, but usually nobody does that for the schemes used in practice, then it's known as at least as hard as ideal SVP. But it's not really clear if it's harder or not. So do these attacks on ideal SVP, do they extend in some way to ring LWE, right? So, and that is a pressing question for future research. And then lastly, I've only talked about passive adversaries, right? You see some ciphertext on the wire, you say, like, here's an underlying hard problem, let me try to solve this underlying hard problem. What we care about is actually active attacks, right? And so these schemes, because they add this noise, they're prone to have decryption failures, right? And then you need to bound them. And then these decryption failures, they might teach you something about the underlying secrets, so that might then lead to a break of your scheme. So some of the submissions to the NIST process, they explicitly rule out this, right? So they pick parameters that you have no decryption failure whatsoever. Other schemes saying we're accepting decryption failures with a certain probability, and then the question is, can you boost this probability somehow by doing some pre-computation, and how much does that affect the security of these schemes? Right, I just want to stress, like, this is only a small part of the questions that we still need to answer. All right, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions. And I see people heading to the mics.
So it seemed in your slides that the circuit complexity penalty of having an exponential amount of memory wasn't reflected in the bit hardness estimates. Does this suggest, in other words, the fact that enumeration uses a lot less memory didn't seem to show up in the like, you have two different kinds of numbers appearing in the top half of the graph. Some are including the circuit size, some are not.
How do you mean including the circuit size? You mean like something like that?
Yes. Are these top numbers just times, or are they taking into account, or is it time times memory?
All of these are times. So they're not. None of this is an area times time model. Yes. So, and then that's the question, right? So how does this behave? And then, in a way, we can give you some partial answer by actually implementing sieving when you have huge amounts of RAM. But the really interesting bit is when you parallelize it across, like, for non-uniform memory access. And then this is future work. You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Other questions? All right, then I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one. So back in the dawn of history, when I did some work on lattice reduction with knapsacks, obviously we were going after 50, 60 dimension problems, and that was what we were able to do at the time. And we noticed a catastrophic drop-off in the effectiveness of LLL. So in what we could approximate versus, and then the quality of the shortest vector, the difference between the shortest vector LLL found and what was the actual short vector. When you go run out at these dimensions, when you don't find the shortest vector, but you find something that is close, do you still notice that LLL running, say running BKZ, that sort of thing, do you get a catastrophic drop-off at some endpoint in terms of the quality of the answer that comes out of it, or do you sort of see a more, smoother progression in the quality of the answer that comes out?
I think the picture has changed in the sense of now the lattice dimensions that we're tackling are much bigger, and we have a whole continuum of algorithms.
Right.
So we don't have this kind of like you run LLL and afterwards you're dead and then there's a drop off. So that's why we don't observe it that much, because we simply run then BKZ20, right, which like takes almost no more time now, like with all the improvements. So that's why we don't observe it, but you can probably, for each of those algorithms, you can probably have a similar thing of like, oh, actually, and then when you go beyond dimension 80 or something, I'm making all these numbers up now, then maybe you still see that. But it's not so relevant now because you simply increase your BKZ dimension slightly and then you're done.
Nigel.
So these are for post-quantum competition parameters, yeah? So, and so you say you can think of LLL as BKZ2, yeah? And you can then say, you're saying, and you have this drop-off, catastrophic drop-off, and then you have BKZ20, and if you make the parameters huge, like FHE land, you have a catastrophic drop-off. What happens if you now move the dimensions up to FHE level parameters, like dimensions 16,000, 32,000, 65,000?
So catastrophic drop-off means you actually achieve the quality that we expect. So LLL behaves much better than you expect in small dimensions, and then the catastrophic drop-off means like, and then you get what you expect. So what we're looking at is like in dimension 16,000, we would get essentially what this graph is predicting. So this would be the quality that you're getting out, and that seems to be accurate. I'm not aware, like doing this on dimension 16,000, and I know of your standing challenge of us to run actually LLL in that dimension, but like in terms of the output quality that you expect, so there's no reason to expect that it will be different from what this graph implies.
Again, there's the mic.